Good evening. This is Maurice Chesterfield, and if you are listening to this, well, there's no easy way to say it, but I'm probably dead. I am recording this in hopes that whoever should follow in my footsteps understands the grave and terrible events that took place in the early days of 1923. It began simply enough. I was in London, having just returned from safari down in Rhodesia, when I received a message from an old friend of mine, a Professor Julius Smith. He and I had gone on travel together in Australia many years back, and I had not seen him in a while, so when I received a missive from him requesting a meeting, I was more than happy to oblige. It seems that he was in town preparing to give a speech at the Imperial Institute, I believe, and he requested that I meet him in advance so that we could catch up and talk on old times. Well, on the 1st of January, I gathered up my loyal manservant Akembe and my faithful dog Duke, and made my way down to the museum. We arrived at about 2 of the clock, and when we entered the building, we found that we were not the first there. There were others there waiting for us, apparently also to meet with my good friend. I recognized one of them from the society papers, a Lady Grimley, Dowager Countess, and although I admit I'm no good with British titles or nobilities, she seemed important enough. I went up and made my acquaintance. She seemed friendly enough, if a bit eccentric. There was another woman there, a beautiful widower. Widower Hawthorne was there. She didn't say much to me at the time, but she seemed to be very sharp-minded and seemed to be keeping an eye on all the rest of us. There was also a rather odd man there, one of the little folk, goes by the name of Olivier. He claims to be a prince from Monaco. There were 2 others there as well. One was a antiquities dealer from the States. I believe he said he was from Chicago. His name was Sid Scuckerman. Quiet fellow, shifty eyes. The other was a man who was involved with the cinema, I think. I don't really know much about him. Said his name was Paul Stratz. I don't know about those moving pictures, but they seem to be all the rave these days. We all made small talk, waiting for our mutual friend. It seemed that each one of us knew him from some past acquaintance or job. But, as the minutes rolled by, it became clear that my friend was not going to be coming to join us. Instead, his servant, Mr. Beddoes, came to inform us that he was far too busy to meet, and that he sent his regards. We were all quite disappointed, but with an upcoming speech on the 3rd, it seemed like he had his hands full. I, of course, gave Beddoes a letter to pass to my friend. It had been so many years since we spoke, and I was concerned about his well-being. 2 days later, we all gathered once again to go to Julius's speech. We all made our way down to the Imperial Institute at Kensington, where there was to be a grand dinner, followed up by a number of speeches. The food was quite serviceable. I found it to be relatively palatable for British food. They do have a penchant for rich gravy, which I do not find agreeable, but afterwards, Professor Smith took to the stage. He's always been a bit of a skeptic, so when he gave his speech on hauntings and ghosts, it took many of us aback. For normally he would have torn these theories asunder. He would have showed them for the fraud that they are. But instead, he seemed almost to believe them. Well, I can't quite explain it. He's never been one to fall for such fraudulent ideas, but this time it seemed like he was sold. He showed us pictures that seemed almost comical in their obvious forgery. The audience around us all seemed just as suspicious as we were. There was a great deal of mumbling, and Julius wrapped up his speech. I immediately rose to go speak with my friend. The others came along with me as well. We were all very concerned. It seemed not at all like him, and he did not seem well upon the conclusion of his speech. After speaking with him, he seemed very concerned that the audience didn't believe him, and, well, to be honest, I can't say that we assuaged those concerns, as we didn't really believe him ourselves. I offered to drive him home, and, well, we all departed, taking the professor back to his residence. Upon arriving, I was hoping that we might step inside for a bourbon and perhaps a cigar, that we could talk and catch up, but he seemed altogether too exhausted, so we bid our partings and went our ways. He told us to come back on the morrow and we would discuss what had been going on. On the drive back, I couldn't help but think something wasn't quite right. He seemed preoccupied. The following morning, me and my companions, I guess you would call them, it's far too early to call them friends, but my companions and I gathered for a spot of breakfast before heading over to meet Julius. It seems that there had been some disturbing events the previous night. Prince Olivier found a newspaper article that described a gruesome murder of 3 Turkish nationals. As horrible as that is, what was far more disturbing was the fact that all 3 carried credentials claiming that they were the same person, and all 3 looked very similar. It was all very disturbing, but there was another article, one found by the widow Hawthorne. She found it on the back page of the paper. It seems as if in the night the professor's home had been burned to the ground, and that there was no sight of the professor or anyone else. What's worse, it claims that there was some shadowy figure seen fleeing the scene. Why, we gathered up our things right away and made our way to Scotland Yard. The article said that if anyone had any information that they should go and speak with the Sergeant Rigby. We arrived not half an hour later, made our way to go speak with this sergeant and tell him what we knew. He seemed like an agreeable fellow, although obviously very preoccupied with his case. When we told him that we knew the professor and had seen him the previous night, why, I do believe he considered us suspects for just a moment, but I cleared it up with him right away. We told him we had left the house at 8 o'clock, shortly after dropping off the professor, and he informed us that the fire hadn't happened until nearly midnight. Well, that seemed to mollify his concerns a bit, and he told us that we should contact him if we learned anything else. After speaking with the sergeant, we made our way by car to Julius's house. Boy, when we arrived, there was nothing left. It had been burned to the very foundation stones. There was still smoke rising from the residence of our dear friend, and there were gawkers all about, craning and rubbernecking, hoping to see something. Well, I can't say we didn't join 'em. But our real purpose was to question the folk that were there, see if any of them had seen anything. Turns out most of them were neighbors, and many of them had already turned in when the fire started, so they didn't really see anything. But then we did manage to speak with one Eloise Turner, the neighbor who had reported to the paper about the fire and the mysterious figure leaving. She was relatively sure it was Julius's manservant, Beddoes, that she saw, claiming that the shadowy figure's build and gait matched that of the manservant. Fortunately, we had no idea where we might find him. After speaking with Eloise Turner, we gathered back together to decide our next course of action. We thought it might be best to split up and follow some leads, see if anyone who might have known the professor might know of his whereabouts. It was clear that he didn't perish in the fire, no remains were found. But then where was he? Lady Grimley, the widow Hawthorne, Paul, and Sid all decided to go to the university and speak with some of the professor's colleagues. Meanwhile, Prince Olivier and I decided to make our way to the Oriental Club, where Julius was a member, and after negotiating with them about my expired membership, we made our way inside. The folk there hadn't seen him in months. It had been nearly 3 months since he had stopped in at all, and none of the fellows had actually gone to the lecture last night, so it seems like no one there had known anything about him. I must admit I was a little disappointed that it was a dead end. That said, it did afford me a chance for a bit of bourbon and a cigar, which I always appreciate. Gathering back up with our fellows, we found that he hadn't been seen at the office either, and that none of his fellow colleagues knew his whereabouts. It seems like we had run out of options. We drove back to our hotel, hoping to get a fresh start in the morning. But when we arrived, there was a note waiting for us at the front desk. It read, "Come at once. I haven't long. For God's sake, let no one follow you." It was signed, Julius Smith. We left at once, making our way to a run-down tenement whose address was on the back of the note. Arriving at the address, we immediately went up to the door and gave it a solid knock. I must admit I was taken aback when the door was opened by none other than Beddoes himself. Why, I thought he might have been involved with the fire. I must admit I reached for my knife that I always keep at my side, but it proved to be unnecessary. Beddoes told us that we needed to see Julius right away and ushered us inside. It appears that he had been loyal to Julius all along and that he had actually helped him escape the fire. We made our way upstairs to the bedside of Julius. It seems that he had not escaped the fire unscathed after all. When we pulled back the covers, I must admit I was not prepared for the extent of his injuries. On safari I have seen wild beasts tear a man in two, but none of that prepared me for the horrible burns that ravaged Julius's body, and his face looked like it had been half-cooked. We kneeled at his side, hoping that our friend might tell us why this had happened to him. He looked up to me, and he said, "Friends, there are dire movements abroad. Evil things," he said. Apparently in his research he had come across references to strange and mysterious forces, some of which had constructed some sort of evil artifact called the Sedif-Ka Simulacrum or some such nonsense. Apparently it had been broken into pieces to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. Once assembled, it was a grave and terrible thing. Julius seemed convinced. He said his speech, which was meant to elicit a response and hopefully find those that might believe in his cause, had unwittingly drawn the attention of those who would seek to use this evil thing. He said that there were 3 of them, that they were Turks. My companions and I looked at each other. We were sure this must be related to the 3 Turks that died the previous night. We asked him why. Why would he be investigating such horrible things? He told us that he was planning on gathering all the pieces together and destroying them, so that none might ever be threatened by these evil artifacts ever again. He told us where we might find the pieces as well, that they were located all across Europe. Fortunately, their locations were along one rail line, and he had already booked us tickets. We were going to travel on the Orient Express. It is January 5th, and we are about to leave our hotel to continue our investigation. The train that we are to catch leaves Paris in about a week's hence, so we will be leaving London to make our way there shortly. But before we depart, there are some loose ends we must tie up. How were these Turks involved? Are there any more of them? And what sort of clues can we find before we leave? I hope that on my next recording, I will be able to shed some light on this mystery. Until then, stay safe.